So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on a Saturday evening to deliberate on the theme Fostering Undergraduate Research in University Spaces. When an institution aspires to foster multi, inter, and transdisciplinary experiential learning among students, provide transferable skills like critical thinking and communication, and build social consciousness among the future citizens of the world, research becomes key and an integral component of the curriculum. For over a decade now, Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts has endeavored to build a research ecosystem that promotes undergraduate research as a pedagogic tool to promote the culture of inquiry, both in its philosophical and practical endeavors. A very warm welcome and thank you for joining us this evening to take this session forward. The session today is the third and final in the three-part series on fostering undergraduate research in university spaces, funded by the Shastri Conference and Lecture Series grant from the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute. Thank you, Professor Hariharan, for being here today. Today, Dr. Rukmini Sen from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University Delhi will be sharing her thoughts on research as reflexivity, confronting self and communities. Thank you, Dr. Sen, for joining us today. We thank SICI for giving us this opportunity to engage in conversations with all of you on these important questions for the future of research in higher education spaces across the globe in general, with specific case studies drawn from Canada and India. Professor L.S. Shashidhara, Professor and Dean Research at Ashoka University and Professor of Biology at ISER, in the first session, explored the why and hows of undergraduate research vis-a-vis NEP 2020. By locating universities and higher education spaces at the intersection and interaction of time and space, leading to certain changing expectations from an education institution, he emphasized on the need for a practical problem-solving orientation of contemporary undergraduate classrooms. He also pointed the fact that this will lead to big temper, resilience, empathy, and ethics among the students, which is much needed. Professor Dr. Robert B. Gibbs, a professor of philosophy and religion at the University of Toronto, in his session titled Research for Our Future, Learning the Logic of Inquiry, weaves history with present practice and builds on the expectation for the future of undergraduate research. He emphasized on the critical question of how to think and engage with critique and inquiry for knowledge building, solving problems, and moving towards a just society. Based on his experience in setting up the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto, he proposes literally turning the university upside down and suggests a restructuring of the research ecosystem by placing the undergraduate student at the center. By learning how to learn with the freedom to think for oneself and simultaneously responding to the voices of the other, he proposes a research university can help bring forth new questions and look at the future for a new culture of knowledge production. Moving on to today's session, I request Dr. Anita Patankar, Director, Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts, to please share her thoughts. With 37 years of experience in the field of higher education, she is a founding member of the Liberal Arts program at Symbiosis International University and headed the Symbiosis Center for Liberal Arts, and then went on to set up the Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts in 2011 as India's first liberal arts institute offering a 4-year undergraduate degree program. She has been at the helm of the liberal arts philosophy through the last 15 years. She is also the only Indian representative and the founding member of Alliance of Asian Liberal Arts Universities. She has been a visionary in pioneering the research culture at the undergraduate learning space and passionately believes that education should help students learn the importance of being personally and socially responsible, something very necessary to grow into leaders of substance and be happy and successful in their personal, community, and professional lives. Dr. Patankar?
Thank you, Shweta. Let me first say a very warm good evening to everyone and a very special welcome to Dr. Rukmini Sen, Rukmini if I may call you. Thank you so much, dear, for accepting our invitation, and to Professor Hariharan for being here. I think I'm touched that you've taken the effort to be here on all the three sessions, and that you've participated so much. And that tells me that we're great partners, because we believe in the same thing, that undergraduate spaces are spaces that we need to focus on. And that research is one of those areas, and one of those dominant, strong areas that we all need to invest in, whether it comes to faculty investments in training, because teaching students or teaching anyone how to think is not an easy task. Teaching them how to think critically is even more challenging. Research is something that I think our culture doesn't, and I'm saying this, I could be wrong, but this is my observation, that as a society, we don't encourage people to think critically and to be able to challenge traditional ways of doing things. We are a society that values the old ways of doing things, the tried and tested ways. And innovation is something that as a nation, I think we've started or we've embraced only in the past maybe 20 or 30 years, very consciously, especially in terms of college education. I'm absolutely thrilled that the National Education Policy talks about the need for research. It talks about the need for either a liberal arts or a transdisciplinary education. And I think that bodes well for the nation as a whole. I'm a great believer that students can drive a lot of change, whether it's on social media, which may not always be the most palatable to many of us, because we're new. We're not, at least I'm not a digital native. Whether it's through the research, whether it's through the startups that they set up, whether it's as young citizens, casting their vote, asking for accountability, taking advantage of a right to information. I mean, there are so many things that this young generation is nudging and pushing and pulling us to do. And I think that's absolutely required. And I think it makes me feel good that the future looks a little brighter. At the School for Liberal Arts, we've always felt that research is one way of helping students learn how to think. It's one way of helping students learn what scientific inquiry means, what thinking means, not just feeling or observing. And I'm happy that we've been quite successful at embedding it into our program structure. When I meet colleagues from other universities, like Rukmini's, then I also feel that this is something that faculty across the board now are investing in or realize that they need to invest in. This series, therefore, was critical. When we applied for this, I kept my fingers crossed, and everything that could possibly be crossed was crossed, not just because it meant an opportunity for us to do this, but I also felt that SICI joining us on this meant that we would have a larger platform, and that this would be the first step, a first step in a longer commitment towards creating a space for faculty to interact, to brainstorm, to discuss, to share. I think there are many of us who have good practices that could be shared. There are many challenges that we are facing, which I'm sure everybody is facing. And therefore, I am going to suggest to everyone over here that once this series gets over, we get together and we discuss how we can take this forward. How can we strengthen the ecosystem that already exists? How can we strengthen that? How can we look to make undergraduate research an area of priority? Because this is something new, I think, for the Indian higher education system. So welcome to this third and final in the series. Again, welcome Rukmini, and I look forward to listening to you. I have had the opportunity in the past, and it's always been not only a delight, but a great learning experience. Thank you, Professor Hariharan. Thank you, Shweta, Vaidya, and Sumitra. I look forward to the questions as well. The questions have been great learning moments, which have triggered off a lot of thought in all of us. There are students who have joined us. And let me say that irrespective of whether your future lies in a job, in a startup, in academia, it doesn't matter. The skills that you learn through research are skills that are invaluable and that will spill over and better your decision making and your thinking processes, irrespective of where you are. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a ton. So moving forward, thank you, Dr. Rukmini, for joining us today. A professor of sociology at the School of Liberal Studies and director, Outreach and Extension Division at the Center for Publishing at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University Delhi, Professor Rukmini Sen has been working at the intersections of sociology of law, gender, justice, kinship and family, and cities and cultures. She is the recipient of the 2020 WISCOMP SAAHAS Awards, recognizing her continuous engagements with curricula using an intersectional lens. She was co-investigator on an international research collaboration, Teaching Feminisms Transforming Lives, with the University of Edinburgh, funded by UGC-UKIERI. She is a member of the core group on Women National Human Rights Commission since 2019. As a researcher, she also explores the identity of the self and the role of reflexivity during the course of one's journey through academia and research beyond the inquiry of external phenomena. Her lecture, titled Research as Reflexivity, Confronting Self and Communities, will focus on these transformations and connectedness that an undergraduate researcher may experience during the practice of research activities and the interaction thereof with peer and community. Over to you, Dr. Sen, and my apologies for the internet issues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Deshpande. Good evening, everyone, and it's an honor to be part of this lecture series. And I would like to first extend my thanks to Symbiosis School of Liberal Arts for having me in this platform, and definitely also Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute, collaborating in this extremely important venture of, as we have been discussing, situating the undergraduate student at the center of higher education. Since the first 7 years of my life in teaching was with undergraduate education at a law school in Calcutta, I think one understands what a challenge and also what, how heartening it is to do undergraduate teaching. When one came to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University Delhi, one got the opportunity to teach masters, which one didn't in the first 7 years. It's a different ballgame altogether to teach masters versus teaching undergraduate. So I think I fully would be on page as to why is it that we need to center the undergraduate student. For many undergraduate students in this country, that degree is the last degree. And that is the reason why the skills that we impart in undergraduate education is extremely valuable in whatever students do in their onward journey. I'll share my PPT and then begin the presentation. So I've titled the presentation today, Research as Reflexivity, Confronting Self and Communities. I think although I've used the word self, I suppose one is definitely meaning it in plural. In terms of the multiple selves that one has in the present and in the past, and probably as someone who's done her research around women writing autobiographies, one knows what's the connection between the present moment self, which is writing, and the self that is reflected upon. So I think somewhere I would talk about, the multiple selves in that one confronts while doing research, and also communities, by which I'm definitely trying to talk about social locations that the researcher has and the social location that the researcher confronts in talking to, in being with the participants in the research. Reflexivity is definitely a kind of a pedagogical thread that I suppose and I hope will run through whatever I would be discussing today. I want to start with those of us in higher education spaces who have been fortunate in developing curriculum. And I say fortunate because I know that there are many universities where teachers are not given the responsibility of designing the curriculum. It's done at some juncture. Of course, teachers are involved, but the one who designs and the one who transacts may not be the same always. I've been extremely fortunate that for all the 20 years of teaching, I have been designing courses by myself, both at the law school as well as at Ambedkar University Delhi. So as curriculum designers, what are the few things that we need to remember? And I think the first most important thing while drawing up a curriculum is how representative that curriculum is on whatever theme, on whatever course that we are designing. And our effort usually is to draw up a very exhaustive kind of a curriculum because you want to cover everything and you want to teach everything. Over a period of time, I think one has started to understand that while completing the course is important, but at the same point in time, if we are able to tell and communicate to the students what is the principal rational thread that is running through the course, that is something, again, pedagogically and methodologically very important. And that happens if we make the curriculum representative. Representative how? Number one, representative in terms of the readings that we choose in terms of canons and contemporary scholarship. And I think, since my discipline is sociology, I suppose this, sitting together of the canon and the contemporary is a continuous, debate and discussion. How is it that in a course in sociological theory, is it possible to teach Ambedkar? Is it possible to teach Periyar? Yeah? Or is it that we will only have to teach Marx, Weber, and Durkheim? And so, how is it that you bring in the canon, you bring in the contemporary, but at the same point in time, you also merge the Western and the South Asian. And I think that's a very tricky, thing to do, and yet it is extremely important, primarily because what we eventually, in many cases, we end up doing is that we have a whole list of Western sociological or social scientific thinkers. And then when we get to probably studying the Indian society, then we study a few of the Indian, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists. So, there's this distinction between thought and studying society is kind of clearly there, and how is it that one can bridge that gap is extremely important. Second is that how are intersectional themes covered and developed? Now, it's very interesting that over a period when one studied sociology in the middle and late 90s, both in Calcutta as well as in Delhi, themes like gender, caste, indigeneity, ethnicity would probably come in an existing reading, would not necessarily come separately. Or even if it would come in as a last reading in, let's say, a certain module. My experience in the law school has been that there's a compulsory course on jurisprudence, and teachers would definitely say that we will be able to teach feminist jurisprudence only for one class at the end of the course because everything else takes so much amount of time. And So how is it that one actually covers some of the issues that feminist jurisprudence raises, maybe in a module around equality, and not wait for feminist jurisprudence at the end to bring in that context? Yeah. So I think that how is it that we talk about intersectional themes throughout the course outline and not necessarily have separate modules which address caste, which address, sexual orientation, which addresses disability. So, this, how the balance between the separateness and the mainstreaming is something which is very important, primarily because gender mainstreaming definitely has been one of the main, both political as well as academic, as well as an academic objective for a long period in time. How do we make inclusive reading lists? And I think that is something that over a period of time has become very important. Who is it that we are reading? How representative is the reading list? And again, I would think it's not just about canons and contemporary scholarship. How inclusive is the reading list in terms of representation? How inclusive is the reading list in terms of diversity of the country? And it isn't that we end up studying only, let's say, society, politics, culture in the center of India. But we talk about various places and regions and understand that diversity, which comes through an inclusive reading list. And finally, I think as curriculum designers, there's a very important role that we play in designing assignments. And I'll talk about, some of my initiatives about designing assignments which involve the element of research. And the reason why I think that creative and imaginative assignments are extremely important as curriculum designers is because it has to speak to the course outline. It has to speak to the representative reading list that we have. So the assignment that we do needs to echo what the students have actually read through the course, not necessarily, not necessarily remember what a particular sociological thinker had said. So how is it that we are understanding, those readings become important? Which is the reason why the right-hand side is what I'm kind of mapping, that as a curriculum designer, we keep these things in mind. We are trying to make the student read. And I think over a period of time, one has come to understand that our education systems are heavily posed towards judging and assessing writing skills of students. But even before getting to the writing, one actually has to read and comprehend. To what extent do we teach students how to read, what to assess and analyze from the reading? And it is not just when we talk about this, the immediate thing that we get to is language. And English language and how difficult the language is. And I don't think that is what I'm trying to say. While language can pose as some kind of an impediment, but it is not for only those who haven't had an English language school education. Yeah. So what is it? How is it that I'm reading, and what is it that I'm getting in terms of comprehension? That becomes very important, because that is what is going to get to writing. And how does one write? Through writing, what is the kind of analysis that one is doing? Eventually, what is the student articulating? So I think as curriculum designers, we need to have a constant conversation between what is the objective of the course, what is the outcome of the course, and what are the assignments of the course which speak to the outcomes and objectives. This brings me to kind of trying to understand and map the field of undergraduate education in India. And I'm using the AISHE 2019 and 2020 report in terms of looking at some of the figures with respect to undergraduate education in the country. While this survey covered all higher educational institutions in the country that had registered with the SSLA code, institutions were categorized under university, college, and standalone institutions. And we'll see that these are the numbers that we are talking about in terms of universities, in terms of colleges, and in terms of standalone institutions. And the total enrollment for higher education has been estimated at 37.4 million, which consists of 19.2 million male and 18.2 million female, and females constitute 48.6% of the total enrollment numbers. This is a number which we need to be proud of, primarily because very clearly women have been entering the higher educational institution spaces in the last 10 to 15 years. Enrollment rates have gone up. And that is what we see in this next sentence, which is the gross enrollment ratio is 26.3 for those between 18 and 23 years. That's the age group that we are talking about also when we are talking about undergraduate education. And this vis-a-vis male population is 26.3 for females, 26.4 for scheduled caste, 23% for scheduled tribes, 17.2%. We do understand when we look at the different categories as to where is it that representation in terms of entering into higher education institution spaces is happening. What is interesting to also note that the highest number of students are enrolled in the arts courses. And science is the second major stream, while commerce is the third major stream. According to this survey, the highest number of students who are enrolled in undergraduate courses across the country, and that's the number that is being talked about here, it's a sweeping 79.8% of students in undergraduate education. So that's the kind of student strength that we are talking about. And undoubtedly, we then need to make this student at the center and at the heart of higher education, teaching, learning, building for the future, etc. Keeping this as, in some ways as a background to what is happening in the Indian context in terms of enrollment figures, what I would now want to go to is that when we think about the student who has entered the higher education institute space, one is to find an entry. That itself is not an easiest of things. And yet, policies around affirmative action in the last 15, 20 years have definitely made classrooms much more representative, much more diverse in the last 10, 20 years. And that's also the reason why we are seeing these kinds of numbers in the 1920 SSLA report. Now, when a student enters the classroom, what should the classroom do, or what should be the ethics in a classroom? And I think, there are moments in our, in our life as teachers that we definitely think about the classroom, but I think classroom is the least talked about and researched space, other than those in the field of education studies who definitely study the classroom, much more in terms of school education and classroom, rather than maybe higher education institution spaces and classroom. So what do I mean when I think about classroom ethics? And I think one is driven by three principal ideas: dialogue, empathy, and democracy. And if I have to, kind of extend this, then the way I would do it is that when we are thinking about dialogue in a classroom, we are referring to the value of listening. And to inculcate the value of listening is an extremely important methodological requirement, primarily because in most of social science field research, we give a lot of importance to observation. We give a lot of importance to conversation and talking and finding out the data and culling out the information. Yeah, somewhere in all of this, listening seems to get lost. And the researcher seems to be at some kind of a pedestal, who is there to collect information and come back. And therefore, and to see, first of all, there is a gaze, and then the researcher collects information and comes back. But I think the importance of the ocular is extremely, extremely fundamental. And that is something that one needs to facilitate in the classroom, to listen. But to listen to a plurality of perspectives. And I think increasingly one understands the importance of listening to a dissenting opinion, listening to a perspective which may not be in line with my perspective, my politics, my ideology. What is the space that we create of that dialogue in the classroom? A teacher needs to be the facilitator towards encouraging that dialogue, towards listening, towards respecting the plurality of perspectives. Empathy being the second. Again, I would think that over a period of time, one has understood by, of course, reading, various feminist philosophers, etc., as to what is the importance of empathy in a classroom. And one wants to actually say that while in the classroom empathy is important, dialogue, empathy, and democracy are also in some ways the pivotal principles through which the curriculum has also been designed, which is the reason why one was thinking and talking about representation being at the heart of curriculum design. So if representation is at the heart of curriculum designing, then that curriculum which would be taught in a classroom, in that classroom, the ethics would be driven by dialogue, empathy, and democracy, understanding different social situations of different students, being compassionate. And how is it that, one balances and the coexistence of being compassionate and yet being able to be firm to the student is a continuous learning experience, I think, as a teacher. And finally, democracy. I'm a firm believer that it's extremely important that we bring in the language of democracy in all kinds of spaces. We kind of leave the language of democracy to the political space only, forget it absolutely in the familial domestic space. And I'm kind of trying to think that a classroom is a process of democratization. Primarily because if this is the amount of students who have been able to access higher education in India, then there has already been a democratization of education. Of course, in a certain number, the journey is still huge. But after having entered the space, what are the ways in which the institution handholds the students? And unless that happens, then democracy would remain only to the extent of entering, but then it will falter with respect to the everyday life of a student inside the higher education institution space. So the classroom, therefore, needs to encourage participation of students, but also needs to encourage peer learning. And I think, since I would go to talking about my, different experiments of assignments, I think peer learning is an extremely important aspect through which we again value plurality of perspectives. I'll talk about primarily 3 experiments, AUD experiments in undergraduate teaching, and briefly mention 2 experiments in postgraduate teaching, which I personally believe can also be replicated in the undergraduate teaching. So I'm talking primarily about certain creative assignments that one tried to do. But what I'm also trying to discuss today is through these assignments, what is the research skill that I'm trying to teach? So first thing that I would want to say is that AUD still does not have a separate paper on writing a research dissertation at the undergraduate level. It doesn't have one. We do have an MA dissertation component, but we do not have an undergraduate dissertation. Of course, now with the NEP, there are these shifts that are going to happen, and I'll talk about it in a bit. But having said that, although there may not be a full dissertation writing or a research writing paper, there is definitely a paper around research methods and techniques of doing research that undergraduate students in most of the social science disciplines do, not just in sociology. And together with it, the kind of assignments that are given to the students, it is to inculcate knowledge around research. So I would first talk about this one experiment in this marriage, family, and marriage, kinship, and family forms. It's a very common course in, in undergraduate sociology. One of the things that I asked the students to do, and I wrote it exactly like this. So I'm quoting from what I had written to the students. Describe a court marriage or an elaborate marriage ceremony or a small gathering to mark togetherness that you have witnessed in the recent times. You would realize that in this, I have already made 3 kinds of concepts connected with marriage, kinship, and family forms. It could be a court marriage. It could be an elaborate marriage ceremony, which is the most common thing that we see. And it could also, it may not be a marriage, but it could just be a small gathering of people marking togetherness, sharing the domestic space, which may not be, which necessarily may not happen through the institution of marriage. But has the student witnessed it? And if the student has witnessed it, then the student is supposed to write a blog piece, basically. And I've said that you use your observation techniques to write the blog piece. So what one is trying to teach here is definitely observation techniques. This through one kind of an assignment. Another kind of an assignment, and I try to always give group assignments to students, has been through building up presentations around how in contemporary India, love arranged alliances happen. Again, you might, alliances happen by surveying marriage alliance websites or dating apps, and then do an analytical reflection on the concepts that the paper is trying to cover. So concepts around kinship, which is buttressed through caste, religion, gender, sexual orientation, able-bodiedness. So what I'm trying to probably make us think about is that through these 2 assignments, one is connecting with the teaching that has happened. Students would have been, exposed to both anthropological works around marriage, but students would also have been exposed to how do marriage alliances today happen through, let's say, marriagematrimony.com, or love alliances happen through Tinder. And how is it? So students are constantly using these, looking at these. But how do you reflect upon it sociologically are the techniques that one is trying to teach. The other example that I would like to give is from a course around culture, identity, and society that I have done, where the main important research technique was to conduct an interview. And to conduct an interview over phone, email, face-to-face. This course was running through the pandemic. So, face-to-face couldn't have been the main, basis of conducting an interview. But conduct an interview where age was a very important factor. So there was, we did a module around youth and aging, and the students had to keep that age in mind. So one therefore was teaching sampling, one therefore was teaching how do you do the interview, and then after doing the interview, you again make certain slides and to reflect upon the interview, to make arguments around concepts of youth aspiration, humiliation, or isolation from the family, or loneliness or separation from children. These would be concepts and these would be discussions that we would have done through the course, through the readings in the course. A third example that I would like to give is on this course on politics, law, and society, where the students had to submit a term paper in which they had to take a particular political movement, understand its history, and interview at least one person who've been part of this movement. A very interesting kind of a question that came from students in, while doing this interview is that how will we interview people whom we don't know? So they know what movement to take, but then they probably do not know how to figure out who is the person that you would interview. So then the question that came was, then how do you choose the movement in the first place? Do you choose the movement because it exists as an abstract movement somewhere? Or do you choose a movement to engage with this because you know somebody, because you participate, because you may participate in it, your friends may have participated in it. So again, the question, the research, tools that one was trying to explore here was, how is it that you historically study a social movement? And again, do interviews, reflect upon it. So I think, through these examples, probably what I'm trying to come to is that while there may not be a separate course on research dissertation at the undergraduate level, yet in many higher education institutions, we can still give techniques of definitely curiosity, techniques of what are the questions to be framed while, let's say, doing an interview, techniques of sampling as to who to interview and who not to interview, techniques around analysis of the interview that, that one has, got. Two examples that I have used in the MA class, and I'm actually hoping to use one of these in the BA course on research methods that I'll be teaching from next week, is how do you know the social outside the classroom? And one of the things that one has attempted to do is to conduct walks in the city and to bring out by conducting the walks, it's basically knowing the city, navigating the city, but then also engage with questions around claiming the public space, engage with questions around fear, and how do you overcome fear when you walk the city in a group, especially after a certain point in time in the day. Or also engage with questions of, our university is situated near to one of the metro stations in the Delhi metro line. And one exercise that we tried to do was that we always come out from one metro gate and come to the university. That's the only route that we know. What would happen if we change the route, use another metro gate and come to that same place? How do you know that city differently? And it was, the kind of reflections that came from just that detouring was amazing. But the larger idea through this is that, kind of trying to understand that when you are in the quote unquote field, we can't give a huge exposure of the field, right? Like an anthropologist. But when you are in the field, then how is it that you are navigating with the city? How is it that you're navigating with your social? Which makes me come to this, what is it that we are saying when we are saying that we are confronting self and community? If self or selves is at the center and at the heart, then there are two different kinds of things that, through the courses and through both curriculum design as well as classroom ethics, as well as research, teaching that one is giving, two kinds of things that one is encountering. One is culture, community, constitution. I think that's one set of ideas, one set of concepts that one engages when one, let's say, one does an observation of a court marriage. Let's say one is observing or one is doing an interview with a social movement person. Yeah. So culture, community, and law and the constitution is one set of encountering that is happening where the self and the community is interacting. Another pillar through which we could look at how is the self interacting, it is happening again through questions of plurality, citizenship, and alliances. I hesitated from using the word solidarity and use the word alliance primarily because that it is extremely important to recognize difference and talk about alliances rather than maybe talk about sameness and solidarity. So the other kind of matrix through which we can understand the self and the community interaction, which happens through research, is engaging with questions around plurality, citizenship, and alliance building. And again, kind of trying to go back to the experiments that one has done in course designing as well as assignments, that citizenship on the one hand and community on the other hand, these are definitely two matrix through which the self is constantly being questioned. So there is not just a transformation of the culture that one is studying, the community that one is engaging with, but the transformation of the self as an undergraduate student researcher. So I think the larger objective of need for undergraduate research is that there needs to be an unsettling that the student has. There needs to be a disturbance that the student faces while doing research. And I think, discomfort is one concept that I deeply engage with as to what is the pedagogical purpose in any form of teaching. Classrooms needs to be spaces where there is a certain kind of discomfort that is created. And through research, the discomfort is only heightened. And it's keeping that in mind that the images that I have in this slide actually comes from questions around citizenship, around questions of plurality, around alliance building, and in some ways as if are also some kind of an entanglement between the selves and the community, which is the reason why I'm using this Gaunt painting. Just, the last bit of what I would be saying is, while the National Education Policy of 2020 is, one of our immediate, texts that we have to engage with, I was actually going back and looking at other educational policies that has come in India. To go back to the Kothari Commission report of 1966, and it's very interesting that in that report, the immediate and the most important emphasis was on science education and research, technical education and research. And it is at the postgraduate level that training and research were otherwise talked about. But vis-a-vis science education and research, no distinction was actually made between undergraduate education and postgraduate education. That was Kothari Commission 1966. When the National Law School experiment happened, and a position paper was placed by Professor Madhava Menon with respect to what should a law school do, different from law departments that already existed. There were two important principles on which the position paper was built. One was that students should conduct, sponsor, and publish world-class empirical research on the structure, norms, and evolutionary dynamics of legal profession. And another was to innovate and implement new methods and content for teaching law students, practicing lawyers, and related professionals about the profession. So research was actually at the heart of National Law School teaching model and experiment, which is the reason why in the first 7 years of my teaching in the law school, one thing that one had to do was to actually guide law students to write projects. Those were not called dissertations, those were called projects. And by, besides teaching sociology to them and guiding sociology projects, one also had the fortune to guide projects on law, culture and pluralism and disability and law, 2 courses as electives that I did in the law school. So in some ways, research, generating a research culture was at the heart of interdisciplinary law school teaching when it began in the early 2000s. One experiment of UG science education research has happened and through the National Initiative on Undergraduate Science by Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education at TIFR, which was conceptualized in 2004, where it shortlisted 150 students from across colleges in India, and there were this competitive exam, and there was this 2-year nurture program that these institutes did. So what I'm probably trying to say is that undergraduate research is not unknown. Vis-a-vis social sciences and humanities, it may not have happened always in a very defined manner, but AUD is an interesting example as to how we've tried to do it in a very different kind of a way through our courses. We know the national education policy, where 4-year program, which will lead to degree with research, is what is being imagined. And I would echo, Dr. Anita's, position that this is something really important that is being imagined. I would like to end with thinking around maybe conceptualizing reflexivity, and primarily because, as I said, that in some ways, preparing a course outline, thinking about assignments, taking feedback and changing and modifying courses, there is in some ways constantly a conversation with oneself as a pedagogue. So when we think about reflexivity in research, I think some of the most important things within undergraduate research that we should try and emphasize, and I am building upon some kind of a conversation, I would want to believe, between Sharmila Rege's this particular essay, Education as Tritiya Ratna Towards Phule Ambedkarite Feminist Pedagogical Practice, and Bell Hooks's Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom. And through this conversation, if we read these 2, bring them into a conversation, then I think these are the 5 things that one is trying to inculcate into students with respect to research skills, where experience is a very important component through which one does and understands research. And when one is talking about experience, one is actually thinking about, again, empathy is, as we said, is at the heart of that classroom ethics. And that needs to be kept in mind when we think about experience of the self, but also of the communities and people that we are talking about and talking with. It's very important that as researchers and as undergraduate researchers, students understand relations and processes of ruling, which would mean that students understand relations and processes of power. Primarily because the structures in which this research is to happen, power definitely is at the heart of that structure. The importance of recognizing difference, the importance of the ability to relate within equality. Finally, to bring together critical understanding, empathy, love, and equality. The reason why undergraduate students is where the potential lies is, it is for the first time that entering into a higher education institution space, students interact with others from different social locations who are not part of their kinship group or their community. There lies the potential of this interaction in some ways, with the social unknown, which is where the research also begins, right? Research also begins in some ways with the curiosity towards the unknown. And I'm kind of trying to end by saying that as the undergraduate student enters into the higher education institution space, that student is actually entering into that zone of the unknown, away from the protection of family, community, etc., but making new friends and new alliances and relearning the social around the student. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Dr. Sen, for this wonderful, wonderful session where you've been able to truly bring together the idea of the student at the center of undergraduate education programs through research, by bringing in some of the examples that you have been using in your own experience in the classroom. And what is interesting is that over the 3 sessions that we've been interacting, there were some key ideas that have evolved. So the first is essentially looking at the student at the center. The second is the classroom as a co-constructed space, looking at research as a pedagogical tool to help students not just equip with certain technical skills, but also to look at themselves as individuals and multiple individuals, as you mentioned, through the idea of the selves, right? Within the social space, the classroom space, because all of these spaces are essentially bringing together diversity. So thank you very much on bringing together all of this to the forefront. And we would like to now move on to some of the very interesting conversations that are happening in the chat box. So to begin with, I would like to go ahead and say that thank you for putting in your queries, questions, and comments in the chat box. If you would like to go ahead and speak, we would help you unmute and you can go ahead and ask your questions. However, if you want me to relay your question to the speaker, I would be happy to do so. And I think we would follow the chronological order in which these questions have been put in the chat box for ease. To begin with, Mr. Varun Niglani, would you like to speak, or do you want me to relay your thoughts here? Because you've been responding to some conversation on the chat box.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Rukmini, ma'am. My name is Varun Niglani. I teach at Symbiosis School of Economics. And I also teach courses like research methods and agricultural economics, rural development at undergraduate and at the postgraduate level. So, ma'am, my first question was about recently, as I'm teaching research methods in which students have to do a 6 credit research project, and in which group presentations are part of working in a group doing a research project. So students have confronted that the most difficult task that we face is working in a group. It adds to a lot of our stress. And these are the students who have just come to campus after 2 years being working in an online environment, and they are adjusting to the offline environment. And now that made me think, what is that these students are lacking? So now I started thinking from a student perspective that, and can you just share your thoughts on it as a teacher? What can be done? What do they lack, which we can focus on?
Thank you very much, Varun, for that question. I don't think that the students lack anything. However, what we need to keep in mind, and it's interesting that you said that they have now come back and you know, we are trying to do group work with them. One of the things that, you know, I did during the pandemic was that I actually did not give them any group work when we were doing online classes, because especially, so, you know, probably one of the things to think about is that in which year and in which semester are we asking students to form groups? Yeah. A second question to think about is, do we give the students the choice to make their own groups, or do we make our groups and assign it to the students? Yeah. And I think, you know, both has its own, you know, value, importance, whatever. So it is best left to the judgment, you know, in some ways to the teacher, but maybe in sometimes even conversations with students on these actually helps. Yeah. That what would you like to do? Would you make your own groups, or would you want me to do it? I've kind of always had more positive responses when I've asked students to form their own groups. I, of course, give a number that more than 3 is not allowed, or more than 4 is not allowed. You know, that is something which I would definitely do. So I would put a cap. Yeah. But what is very important, I think, Varun, is to what extent do the students know each other in order for them to be able to even form the group? there will still remain students who may not want to be part of groups or who may find themselves left out of groups. Yeah. Now, there can be multiple ways of handling it depending upon the situation that one is in. Sometimes I just leave the student to do the presentation by oneself, yeah, and not, force that student to find one group and, align and associate oneself with it. If the point, so I suppose what I'm trying to say is that what is the larger objective that we are wanting? Yeah, through group work, we are wanting that the students try and, become a team in certain way, try to understand what is it to work in a team, try to understand, who does what, manage time, etc. So that is definitely the objective, which is what I think we need to try and communicate. But if we fail and if the student, doesn't want, I don't think it's necessarily a loss. Maybe we have to give the student a little more time to actually come to that group, maybe at a next semester. Yeah, because, I sometimes feel that the way we think we are at pace with the experiment, the student may not be at that pace. The student actually may want a very classical end semester, textbook examination. Yeah. Maybe the student wants, and I am, feeling very excited with the experiments that I'm doing, but the student may not be excited. Yeah, just might find them very, very difficult. So yeah, I think it would depend upon different circumstances and situations.
Thank you for that very interesting answer. Thank you so much. Professor Hariharan, would you like to go ahead, please?
Yeah, I whatever I wanted to say, thoughts that came as I was listening, I had typed it in.
Yeah.
What I would probably do is to share something that I, not always, but then I remember sharing this story with a whole lot of students in any number of batches. In one of the early classes, in my university, we don't have a BA program in the university department. We have an MA program, but then students would have finished their BA and they would have come in for their MA. So I look at them still as BA students who have just come in. So they would come in with all the things that they would have got from colleges. The way there would have been a way in which they would have learned, done things. So first thing I tell them is this: in my class, what I do is I unlearn with you whatever you have learned and whatever I have learned. Point number one. And then there are two things that I can do to ensure that there is democracy and there is learning. My campus, from my campus, 500 meters, there's a market. It's called the Palayam market, Connemara market. So I tell them there are two things that I can do. One, I can take you to Palayam market and buy you fish. The second one, I can sit with you and we can fish together. Now you decide what you want. That, I think, sums up the spirit of inquiry, that curiosity, and that willingness to do something. And I think that would, in a way, capture all the 3 points that Dr. Rukmini Sen was talking about: empathy, democracy, participation, everything. So that's all I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hariharan. Mr. Subir Bhadri, would you like to go forth with your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Thank you, Rukmini. It's a wonderful talk by you and much aligned to the many issues that I was grappling with whenever I teach. My question is very simple, that before we begin the book, before we begin starting with text, heavy text, every student comes with their own story. And without allowing that to come out, the regular course pressure is that we start giving them content, but we don't expect them to articulate their own, the social different stories that they come up with. So do you think that could help in all the points that you mentioned about discomfort, about different aspects of the society coming together? But we don't have time, so that's the practical limitation. So any thoughts on that front? Thanks.
So, one tries this sometimes, which is within feminist methods, there's this tool, there is this technique of remembering one's grandmother, and to kind of reflect that how has life changed from the grandmother to the mother to me. Yeah. And that in some ways brings together not just actually a personal tale, but also the social times and the historical times in which the grandmother, the mother, and the self is, is a part of the larger social. Yeah. Now, whether this can be done in a huge classroom with 120 students, no, I don't think that is possible. Yeah. As an exercise where we are in a position to listen to everybody, share this narrative. However, is there an opportunity to do this through an exercise in the classroom? Yeah. Is there an opportunity to do this, again, as I was thinking about, is there an opportunity to do this through some kind of an evaluation pattern? One thing which I would still, hold on to is to connect the personal story while talking about it through social history, etc., but to connect it with some reading that has happened in the class. Yeah, I still would want to hold on to that and would value that tremendously. Not in the way of, conservative canonical teaching, yeah, but in the way of actually trying to see as to, maybe experiences of my life and experiences of other, whatever, great sociologists or anthropologists. There can be connections. In some senses, Shubir, I actually think that we also need to reimagine what texts of our classical thinkers or, philosophers that we are using. Yeah, I do think that even that kind of a reimagination is important, as, so I'll maybe take an example from what I do. So of course, when we study Durkheim, we only remember doing, division of labor, religion, etc. And in a course on kinship that I teach, I actually use a really short 3-page essay of Durkheim on divorce. Now, lo and behold, who would think that Durkheim would have written on divorce? He's this, functionalist sociological theoretician who would only talk about the maintenance of family and marriage as an institution. Yeah. So maybe, so I think one important thing is to go back to the classics and to again think what is it that from the classics or contemporary that we are doing. And the second is the lived experience is extremely important. There needs to be a space for that in the classroom through discussions, through exercises, through assignments, connecting it with a broader, academic conversation.
Thank you. Just to bring to, I don't know, when I was a kid, I was reading Bangla author Ashapurna Devi, and she does this wonderful trilogy of the grandmother, mother, and the self. And your example just took me there. Moving on to the next person, I think Varun has another question. And Varun, would you like to go ahead, please?
Thank you. Ma'am, in your slide, you had focused a lot on empathy. You had focused a lot on empathy. First of all, I would like to admit myself that I started teaching last 5 years. And suddenly when in the month of February or January, the classes started offline, it just gave me a life as a teacher to have students in the class. And the topics which you talked about, having empathy in classroom. So I was thinking empathy from who, it could be, if I think of stakeholders, students, teachers and administrators. Administrators give us the infrastructure to take the class. Now when it comes to empathy, could you share some examples from student perspective, teacher perspective, and infrastructure administrator perspective?
Thank you, Varun. I think what you said as to what happened in February, it is a sentiment, I suppose, is shared by all of us who are teachers and probably and hopefully also students here, that, you know, coming back to the classroom actually makes a lot of difference, and being able to see students face to face. See, I do think that, you know, within a classroom context, so again, you know, maybe to use the example of a very difficult times that we went through in the last 2 years because of the pandemic. Yeah, all of us were living through it. And at the same point in time, we were also having to teach, we were also having to evaluate, we were also having to grade students. Yeah, and students may not have been in a position to always submit things on time. Yeah, and again, I know that this is a very, very, very difficult terrain as to the date in which the assignment submission has to happen. Yeah. While being through the pandemic, and when students were not probably submitting the assignment on time, what is it that as a teacher one could do? Rather than marking the student with an F grade or, you know, whatever, an absent grade or whatever, does the teacher write an email to the student and ask, is everything all right? When are you submitting? Does the student, you know, if there is a response, wonderful, but if there isn't a response, then does one try to reach out to, let's say, the class representative and ask the class representative to get in touch with the student, because the student may fear responding to the teacher. Yeah, that, you know, because I'm already late, ma'am will be even more angry with me, therefore I will not do it. Yeah. So, you know, I'm just trying to say whether these are things that we can do. Again, whether we can always do it may not be. Whether we can always do it with 150 students may not be. But with the situation of the pandemic, have we done it? I think that's an important question that we need to actually ask ourselves. Yeah, because I would definitely feel that the 2 years of the pandemic and it should have transformed us as teachers. Yeah. So that's one, you know, with respect to, I would think, a teacher-student kind of a relationship. I would also think that, have we been empathetic towards our own colleagues? I think that also is equally important. Or, you know, so it's not just a teacher-student relationship or a teacher-administrator relationship that we have inside a university or a college space. Our colleagues are not just our academic colleagues, but they also may not be friends, but at the same point in time, are they, you know, our empathetic, comrades? To use, I don't know how good it is to use the word, but yeah, I'm sure you're, my larger point is something which I'm being able to put across. That to what extent did we have even empathetic, you know, colleagues where we were actually understanding different people's situations of maybe having the infection, of having people that one cared for with the infection, of having lost people maybe, because all of us have experienced losses, right, in the last 2 years. So that from the point of view of the administration, the university administration, how is it that the university administration has come forward and probably ensured, you know, very little things, but things like, I don't know, why, internet facilities, which are, you know, because we were just surviving on that, right? So, you know, Zoom, Google Meet, LMS platform, you know, those kinds of things. Did the administration actually provide some kind of a training, a hands-on training? You know, we were asked to shift to online in what, 1 week's time? We didn't know it. Yeah. We had prepared our course outlines not to be taught in an online mode, but then we had to shift like that. Yeah. So did we get any training? Yeah. So those kinds of, things. And again, I would think that as an institution, we also have to understand that the administrators also always always did not have all the answers. Yeah, they were also trying to learn, every day. Yeah, as to how, because we kind of started with thinking that we'll be back in 2 months' time. Yeah, but then it became 2 years. Yeah, so yeah, I think again, I think it's only conversations and dialogues which will help.
True, very true. Moving on, Subir and Professor Hariharan, there is some conversation here in the chat box. Would you like to go back to it, or may I move forward?
There was a lot of conversation there. Let me see what I had written. I think, yes, I had written something, I got a response, and then that was about the process of doing research and the kind of questions that one asks. And I had written that a lot depends on the context from which the researcher comes and the context into which you come and the researcher comes and the kind of interaction that happens. I feel it's a very interesting and engaging dialogic model, if one might put it like that. And I think what's very fascinating is that you have the addresser, the addressee, as it were, the context, and then the kind of things that actually you say, the kind of things, the thoughts that you share, which let us say tries to zero in and capture the referent, as it were, of the conversation. And I think that pretty much would sum up the quality of the research that really comes out of it. So that is what we were trying to share there. That's what was coming to my mind. If I may add to what you were saying about the way in which we were thrown right into this networked knowledge society with the pandemic. What kind of infrastructure did institutions provide you, and where did you locate yourself? Think of this. I think what it did do was it raised certain serious concerns for us in my university. There were students who were living in one bedroom apartment or a small house, hardly any privacy, no network. Yeah. What is it that you can ask them? Will they be able to make a presentation? There were real issues, and then it's not a matter of even showing compassion. It's not a question of even being compassionate. I think it has to do with understanding. So I'll tell you what I did with this. I've never felt comfortable, even now, with Zoom and Google. And I felt that is not the way to do the teaching part, the learning part with my class, 30 students or whatever. So I tried to figure out how many of them had mobile phones, and a couple of them did not have. They had the old phones. So we got together and we got 2 smartphones for them. And I said, we will do one thing, we'll create a WhatsApp group. So all my classes, it would run to 2 hours, 3 hours, or even beyond that. So all my classes would be using WhatsApp. So you type in, or if it's even a seminar presentation, what I do is you tell them, you click this button and then you start talking, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, release it at your leisure. You can download it at your leisure. You can listen to it. You can respond to it. You can keep responding to it. So I thought the biggest advantage was that students at the end of the day would still have access to that conversation, even after 1 week. So they felt that they were able to save some data and they were not pressurized by looking at the screen. So then some student came and said, WhatsApp, I think Telegram is much better, sir. So I installed Telegram and we started switching between these two. They said there are things that you can share, links can be used. So we tried to do that. So the seminar presentation part, I think that was solved. And one big thing was that it was possible to ensure student participation. I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hariharan, for bringing these examples. I think most of us have gone through that during the pandemic, where the WhatsApp became one mode of communication with students, reaching out to colleagues and everything. So it was literally through IT that we have essentially sustained and survived the last 2 years. We have some comments from Mr. Aman Singh, Renu Vinod, who have been appreciating the lecture. So thank you so much on that end. Also, Dr. R.K. Trivedi, wonderful comprehensive with micro research on UG-PG learning lectures. Dr. Vaidya Gundlupet has a question. May I request you to please unmute and ask your question?
Hi, thank you, Dr. Sen. This was a very interesting, very provocative lecture. You talked a lot about democracy, and I have a bit of a concern about conceptualizing a classroom as a democratic space. I mean, pedagogical tools like encouraging participation, peer-to-peer learning, actually are all great to enhance learning. In fact, teachers, like all human beings, learn from social interaction. They learn from students as well. But can we call this as democracy? Because democracy assumes some amount of equality, and there is an inherent power hierarchy in a classroom. Can we really escape that power hierarchy?
No, we can't. We need to be mindful about it. And only when we are mindful about it, can we be able to make the process democratic. Does that make the structure democratic? Maybe not. Yeah. But whether the process and the kind of actions that one is taking, to what extent can it ensure participation, is something that one necessarily has to strive towards. Yeah. So, if you ask me whether being democratic means that the students will decide what questions will be set for the end-term examination, I don't think that that is something that one is actually promoting here. Yeah. So probably what one is trying to say is that in the process of this pedagogy, what is it that is coming across to the student? Yeah. And how is it that even me as a teacher, while being mindful about the fact that I still, in some ways definitely remain, in terms of hierarchy, within the institutional structure also, I remain at a very different hierarchy from the student, yet at the same point in time, that doesn't stop us from encouraging participation, from encouraging more representative voices in the classroom, from thinking about how is it that we can actually hear most students. To me, if we have been able to do even, 1/4 of any of these, then the process, then there is a democratization of the process. Yeah. Democratization of structures. I'm sure, Dr. Vaidya, all of us know that takes, long periods in time. That's one. But the other thing also is that I think, as I said, our focus vis-a-vis democracy somehow seems to remain connected with questions of politics and political participation. And it's extremely important that we actually bring in the language of democracy when we think about kinship, which is another space where, democracy just can't be spoken about. Age and gender just rules, right? And also, therefore, the classroom.
But if I can just add a little bit, see, on kinship and family society, one can think of an ideal situation where an ideal family is a very democratic family. You can think of an ideal family where an 18-year-old will have as much authority and power and decision-making ability as a father or a mother. And even though whether that's practical in the immediate context is different, but we are not thinking of that, even that as an ideal thing in a classroom space, right? So my concern is not about the substance that makes what you're talking of, the processes that are democratic. My concern is about the nomenclature of democracy, because that tells students something really different in the sense that they have an equal voice in decision making. That's the common language. It's a normal understanding of democracy. So when we call this democracy, are we sort of giving a misleading interpretation to students, and actually that complicates class relations even more?
I I think if we go with Ambedkar, then democracy is both political democracy as well as social democracy. And political democracy is something that we get through law and the constitution. And social democracy is something that we have to strive towards in order to reach equality. So I wouldn't definitely assume that equality is a given within democracy. Yes, definitely maybe within political democracy, but vis-a-vis social democracy, we are still striving towards it. And the classroom definitely is a space which can, can be envisaged through that lens.
Thank you, Dr. Vaidya, and thank you, Dr. Sen. We have one of our first year students, Yashit Jain, wanting to ask a question. Please, Yashit, go ahead. Unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for such an enriching and thought-provoking session. And it wasn't a question that I asked, but just like I think Subir sir's question and ma'am's response to it about connecting it to personal experiences just like reminded me of a technique that we had been taught in one of our electives about close reading and making text to text and text to self connections with what you read. And I just think that also connects with what ma'am had mentioned about representation in the curriculum, because when you make text to text connections, even in like papers on a particular topic from different authors and make connections or comparison between them, that also brings in more representation and a greater understanding. So it was just a connection I made, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yashit, for that reflection.
Sorry. Moving on, we have Dr. Renu Vinod wanting to put forth a question. Dr. Renu, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rukmini, again for that wonderful talk. So I'm actually going through a little bit of a struggle with regard to, how I have been teaching research in the past and how I continue to teach research right now. So, the standard operating procedure, there is, research questions you can ask, there has to be a significance, and you have to look at literature. And when you have to teach the technique, then there has to be a hypothesis and all of that. But today you use the word discomfort even when it came to students, but now I'm beginning to sense this discomfort. Is this the only way to do research? Because I do wonder, especially when I see sometimes there might be some struggles with regard to writing. So are we doing this the wrong way? Should we, you have all of these experiences going out in the, for the walks and everything, and Subir also raised the problem, the question of time. So do we start with all these observations, coming back into the classroom, free writing, and then seeing how these lead one to concepts and research questions and literature? So what is your experience?
Good to see you, Renu. And thanks so much for that, question. So one of the questions that I always encounter is, we are struggling to write the hypothesis. Yeah, and we don't have undergraduate research. So this is at our master's dissertation. We are struggling to write what the hypothesis is. So my standard thing is always, ठीक है बाद में सोच लेना उसको. But by which not trying to necessarily say that don't have an hypothesis. Yeah, but how is it that, what is it that the field is telling you? The field could only be a review of literature, by the way. The field may not actually be always, the outside. That is what we think, right, about the field. But the field could just actually be trying to map something over a period of time. Let's say, EPW pieces on social science research in India. That's the subject of research. Do it through a review of essays that has been published in the Economic and Political Weekly. See what has happened over the decades. Yeah, that itself is also research, right, in a certain way. At an undergraduate level, I think it's extremely, extremely important that we teach students how is it that you do a really comprehensive review of literature. because it is by doing a comprehensive review of literature which actually will enable students to come to the research question definitely. Yeah, unless the review of literature is done. So, you know, I don't know whether we can actually have, you know, some kind of a given protocol that first we listen to students, hear their experience, then we give them the concepts, then we ask them to do research, then they theorize. I don't know whether that is necessarily going to work. Yeah, at an undergraduate level, at the first year of their learning. I think in the first year of their learning, or in the first and second years, we need to be, you know, we need to be really nurturant in certain ways. And so, you know, so by nurturant, I suppose what I'm trying to probably think about is that how do we actually communicate the concepts to them in the way in which they will be able to identify with, talk to the concepts. That's the, you know, that's the reason why I feel that teaching undergraduates is the most difficult thing to do. Yeah. And because, you know, my teaching began teaching sociology to law students who were constantly questioning, why is it that we are studying sociology? Why aren't we studying criminal law, torts, etc.? It was even more difficult. So, you know, one of the things that our, you know, vice chancellor in the law school, Professor B.S. Chimney, used to tell us is that what kind of reading materials are you giving to students? And I still remember that as the most valuable lesson that I have learned from my law school teaching days. And I think it's extremely important that we give students a mix of reading materials, yeah, both text as well as visuals, for them to be able to connect to that concept. So not to give up on the concept, yeah, and immediately go to experience and think that through the experience the student is going to, the student may not want to talk about the experience. What will we do then? Yeah, so therefore I don't think that we have to give up on the concept, but I think we really have to, as undergraduate teachers, think what is the reading material that we give to students. In all the Board of Studies meetings that I attend in our university, one of the first comments that I think I end up making is, isn't these too difficult readings for undergraduate students? Will the students be able to grasp all of this? By which not to say simplify. Yeah, by which to think, are there alternate readings possible which will communicate something, maybe not in the most academic of languages that we want to communicate. Yeah, why are textbooks important in undergraduate level? We realize that. And nowadays, good textbooks are not even being written because we don't write textbooks, right? So, anyway, so, you know, I where I would probably think about. So one, there isn't a formula. Two, let's think about how do we nurture them in the first 2 years for them to be prepared to be able to even ask the question. Yeah, to be even able to ask that research question. There needs to be a lot of nurturance in the first 2 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Renu, as well. Then let's move on to Subir. He has put forth another question.
Thanks. So this question is, as a disclaimer, I have very little experience in teaching. So I'm hardly a few semesters. So, but I have seen this difference in first years asking a set of questions, and the fourth year is asking a very different set of questions. And then the postgraduates I've never taught, but that's the question that how does this change? I have taught engineering students. They ask a very different set of questions. So, and the fear or the doubt I'm expressing is that a lot of times the more text students read, and maybe even when I read, I'm paraphrasing the voice of the author rather than my own thoughts. So my own thought processes are disturbed, which may not amount to anything, but still something that I think, I don't know what's your experience across the different years, and let's say across the different, say, non-humanities, if you have an experience of that. Thanks.
By non-humanities, because
Okay.
your experience is in the engineering, right?
Yeah.
Okay, to me, the closest would be law, which of
Correct.
course is social science in some ways. But anyway, I think first I'll try and respond to, to see the student evolve is the most, is the most amazing thing as a teacher. Yeah. We sometimes get to see, we sometimes even don't get to see it. You know why? Because in a university like ours, where we have to do BA, MA, PhD, all teaching and supervision, sometimes, we only teach maybe 1 or 2 semesters in the BA and then we leave them and then we are teaching the MA, etc. So it doesn't happen. But on occasions that it has happened, in the last 3 semesters, I've been teaching the same BA batch for the last 3 semesters. And it has been amazing to see the way in which questions evolve. Yeah. The way in which student participation increases. Yeah. And the way in which students are able to connect what they are studying in my course with what they are studying in some other course. Yeah. And, that's really an aha moment in the classroom if that happens, that we were doing this in that class and now we are seeing that you are saying this, and so that's just amazing. So that is one kind of an evolution. I think another kind of an evolution that you see is in the way in which they submit their writing. Yeah, in the way in which they write their assignments. Yeah, even that changes, usually over a period of time, not always. Yeah, not always. By always, I mean not with everybody. Yeah, but with definitely, some to a majority. Yeah, and if that happens, then again, that is wonderful. Because what we tend to start then seeing is, so to me, I think what is very important is that have the student been able to comprehend what is being expected out of that assignment. Yeah. If that is something that student has understood and the student has tried to communicate that, maybe not in the best of English. Yeah. But the student has understood the terms of reference of the assignment, which is the reason why I feel, how is it that as a teacher, I am communicating what I'm wanting out of that assignment is very, very important. That is my responsibility. I cannot expect all students to just understand what I'm expecting. Yeah, I try to, while I give that this is what I want from an assignment, it's literally like reading half a page or 1 page full, because very detailed explanations are, I feel, actually needed to be given to undergraduate students. I think, Subir, to a postgraduate student, it is also the same. Yeah, you still have to do all that, detailed things that you do for undergraduate. Why? Because what kind of undergraduate education has the student come from is very important. No? So much of the times I feel that those students who've learned sociology and is doing sociology with us in the MA, a lot of time goes in trying to actually make them unlearn the sociology that they have learned. Yeah, it's a trouble. But that aside, I think some of the characteristics actually remain the same. Primarily because we are dealing with a time and a generation where reading is not the habit. Yeah, that habit doesn't exist. Because that habit doesn't exist, for whatever age group that we are talking about, we end up, having to do similar kinds of strategies and tricks. Just one last thing with respect to non-humanities, vis-a-vis law, one of the kind of questions and questions that I would always have in the law school was, okay, ma'am, you've done this, you've given us a critical assessment, etc. Tell us, how do we solve this situation? Yeah, give us a solution. Yeah, this need for solution, this need to actually quick fix, was something which was a constant demand in the law school. Yeah, and that, while maybe at the initial years, I used to feel really agitated that, you can't fix, complexities around caste and kinship so easily, and definitely not through a law. But then over a period of time, one probably started to even value that what is it that the student is also wanting? The student is trying to probably understand a technique through which she can make sense of how will this change. So the student is asking for a transformative lens. Yeah, and I think that was a very valuable, that would push one and would be a very valuable discussion in the classroom.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Moving on, we have Professor Hariharan. When we were talking about how to conduct research in smaller bits, I think he has a comment to make. Professor Hariharan, would you like to go ahead?
You could read it out.
Okay.
I don't want to repeat it. Yeah.
Sure. So he writes that I asked students to prepare a working bibliography, a bibliography that works for them to see the research problem, the gap, that helps a lot to work towards a hypothesis. True. Sometimes it's extremely important. Actually, I teach anthropology, and there it's a huge difference because they come from a research methods class where they've learned to build hypotheses. And here I'm trying to tell them that, you need to look bottom up. So don't build a hypothesis. And it's very difficult for them to, deconstruct the variables and the hypothesis and a null hypothesis. But I'm saying, it's free flow. Just go observe and come back. So that's another challenge that you face in social science research, because there's such different techniques that we are trying to engage the students with.
Both very important.
Yes, both very important. Definitely, Professor Hariharan, definitely. Dr. Richa Menocha, she has a comment. Would you like to go ahead and speak, Dr. Richa?
Can you read, Shweta? I have some background noises.
Sure, no problem. Definitely, no worries. So she says, very interesting, Dr. Rukmini. Particularly echo with your thoughts on inculcating a culture of listening up. Journeys from the real to the abstract, the classroom becoming a space from knowledge is produced through sharing live experiences, through comparing and contrasting across time and spaces, encouraging discomfort and problematizing almost anything resonates with some of my approaches. Thank you, Dr. Richa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richa.
Thank you, audience and participants, Dr. Sen, my own colleagues from SSLA and otherwise. It's been an invigorating session, many things resonating with stuff that we do in our own classrooms. And so I think we're all buzzing with energy and probably wanting to share that in many more meetings to come. But to conclude the 3 days, the 3-session journey that we started way back on the 19th, right? So over the 3 sessions, what we were trying to do was engage with certain questions of the hows and whys of undergraduate research. First of all, why an undergraduate research with the NEP coming in and the focus on research and the kind of diversity that India deals with in terms of access to education and equity towards education. This question of why research and burden the student more and more has been at the center of many conversations. So the why of research was extremely important, and across the 3 sessions, we realized that we were looking at research not just as a pedagogical tool in terms of helping students to become employable, but also in terms of building those very critical lessons into inquiry, building those very important lessons into actually asking important questions, not just for someone else, but for yourself and your own family and the community, to essentially become those critically conscious citizens of the future. So with that why, if research then is important, then how do you do it? And I think over the last 3 lectures, again, how do you do it, and some very objective tools, literally where you break down the classroom space in terms of the entry point of a student, bringing into the design and the curriculum, and then linking it to what you want out of that curriculum, what you want the student to learn, and how do you do this with text, but along with the text, the assessment. So a very objective way of looking at practical classroom engagements. I think the why and the how that we started with both have been answered over the last 3 sessions that we went ahead and engaged with. However, to conclude, I really and sincerely hope that today may be the last day of the session for the 3-session series that we started, but I think it's only the beginning of the conversations. So looking forward to many, many more of these conversations and collaborations, because I think there is a certain sense of collaboration that already exists, and what is required is to take that forward. So with that, thank you so much, everybody. And I now request Dr. Sumitra to take over. Dr. Sumitra, all yours.
Thank you, Shweta, and thank you, Professor Sen, for a lecture that encouraged a lot of self-reflection. We're at the end of 3 lectures, and as it had to happen, I've lost power. So I'll stay off video. So you really can't see me wildly gesturing to indicate how exciting all of this has been, but hopefully you can hear it in my voice. So we've come to the close of this lecture series. And I'd like to take a few moments on behalf of my colleagues, Vaidya Gundupet, Shweta Deshpande, and me, to convey our gratitude to everyone involved. We organized this lecture series hoping for an opportunity to open up a discussion on and involve more people in conversations around an activity that is central to SSLA, undergraduate research. And to have 3 speakers who've all spent a great deal of time thinking about undergraduate research philosophically, as well as leading practical efforts to improve how things are done at various levels, be it within a single classroom, as Professor Sen described today, or at a newly created institute, as Professor Gibbs described the other day, or at the mind-boggling scale of 10,000, introducing 10,000 teachers in schools and colleges to research-based pedagogical tools, right? This has given us all a chance to maybe find the right words and frames for our own experiences in university spaces through their thoughtfully delivered lectures. So thank you, Professor Shashidhara, Professor Gibbs, and Professor Sen. The promise of these lectures for me really has been the incredible range of questions that have opened up, and not at all easy questions at that. Questions that were both posed by the speakers and by participants in the discussions. So what is the place for top-down approaches when an engagement with the logic of inquiry perhaps requires a bottom-up orientation? When the process of sort of brewing questions in your head, then holding them long enough for them to mature, as somebody said, and eventually sort of getting them to a form where they can be articulated as well-posed problems, when that process is slow, how do we enable that sort of engagement when all other structures of teaching, learning, and evaluation are time constrained? Some of you very candidly spoke about the difficulties of navigating expectations that come with institutional ranking frameworks and perhaps worrying global publication practices. So thank you for being candid and bringing those conversations to the table. So thank you all, faculty, students, and others interested in these conversations who've joined us over these 3 lectures. The impetus for thinking of how this lecture series can materialize came with the call for applications for a lecture series grant from the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute. So we are very, very thankful to Shastri for the funding and overall support. Professor Hariharan is here, both as a representative of the Shastri Institute and as a very active and thoughtful participant. So thank you very much, both for your presence and your insights. Thank you. Thank you also to Dr. Anita Patankar and our faculty colleagues at SSLA for their constant support. Thank you to the SIU and SSLA IT department, as well as to the accounts department for all their help. Thank you to the communication cell at SSLA for helping spread the word. And thank you to our students, Neha Dadke, who designed the design on the poster, and research cell interns, Rekha Shrestha Tumane and Rinalini Niranjan for all their support through the lectures. So thank you all. We hope to have you join us to carry some of these conversations forward in whatever ways we can in the future, like Shweta said. Thank you, and good night.
Thank you again, and good night, everybody. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye-bye.